Welcome to session 5 of Made for More as we consider a really important question. What's in your hand? Because whatever you have in hand, God can use it to work miracles. We've spent time clarifying our core values, dreaming about what God could do with the seed that we sow over the course of 100 years, and we spent time pinning down our sense of purpose in the world. And all of that is essential when you think about being made for more. But sometimes God just surprises you, and He uses something in your life that you didn't even think of as a gift, something that you saw as unimportant, and He wants to use it in miraculous ways. So for some great encouragement in our journey of being used by God to bless the generations, we turn our attention in this session to the story of a man who was convinced that God couldn't use him, and further tried to convince God that God couldn't use him. Spoiler alert here, it's usually a futile thing to try to convince an all-knowing Creator that He can't use you. The man's name was Moses. Yes, the great deliverer Moses at first tried to talk God out of using him. Exodus 4, verse 1. Moses answered, "Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you." Well, what's Moses saying here? Well, what's his fear? He's afraid that he'll be ineffective, powerless, and unconvincing when he tells the people that God has appointed him to deliver them. Never mind the fact that Moses has met with God in a burning bush, heard His audible voice, been the first person to hear God's personal name. Moses still doesn't think he's the man for the job. No one will listen. No one will follow. No one will believe me. Moses might as well have said, I can't be a blessing. Might as well have said, I can't be used for God's purposes. He might as well have said, I just have nothing to give. Well, I hope by now in our study of the seed principle, that which is small bears multiplying fruit, that God starts with small blessing that grow exponentially, I hope that you're accepting that no word, thought, gesture, gift, or investment of generosity or faith is ever small in God's eyes, because it's a seed, and He sees the generations being blessed. But if we're honest, we've all felt like Moses at times, affecting big change, making a big difference, being used by God in some powerful way. It just seems like, well, it must be for someone else. To help Moses find encouragement, the Lord asked the faithless fellow a question. Exodus 4:2. The Lord said to him, "What's that in your hand?" Jewish rabbis are famous for answering a question with another question. In fact, a lot of humor in Jewish circles revolves around this. It's a culture that's learned the art of asking questions. So like a boy comes home from college and he's made a D in physics, and his mother says, "What's with this D in physics?" And he responds, "Who am I, Einstein?" Or "Hey, Mom, what's for supper?" And she says, "Hey, who you think I am, your personal chef?" In other words that become questions for questions. And maybe the funniest I always thought was a student who comes to a rabbi and says, "Rabbi, good teacher, why is it whenever I ask you a question, you always respond with a question?" And the rabbi said, "So what's so bad about a question?" Moses is full of questions for God, but God's got a question for Moses. God said, "What's that in your hand?" When God asks you, when an all-knowing deity asks you a question, it's not so He can gain information. God already knew quite well what was in Moses' hand, but Moses didn't know. He might have known that he had a wooden stick in his hand that was a shepherd's crook that he could use for guiding sheep or fighting a wolf, but he didn't really know what was right at hand. What's in your hand? Moses said, "A staff." Okay, it's a stick. So what? He thought it was nothing, but God saw a miracle in it. The staff was a symbol. I think the reason the Lord chose the staff as the first sign that He would give Moses is that it was a symbol that Moses had become a shepherd, and in the natural sense, what had happened was Moses was a Hebrew baby who was, by God's providence, raised in Egyptian royal court as if he were royalty. But then after he murdered an Egyptian, he had to flee, and he was in exile in Midian. He was no longer amongst the Hebrew people. He was no longer amongst the Egyptian people. He was a man without a home. He was in exile. He was an alien. He named his first child Gershom, which means sojourner or alien. He'd become a shepherd. The shepherds were despised by the Egyptians. It was considered a lowly task. The irony of all this is that Pharaoh had treated Moses like a prince, but now instead of being in the lap of luxury, Moses is in a poor place with a few sheep. He's a shepherd. So the shepherd's staff was a symbol of his obscurity, a symbol of the seeming nothingness of his life. It would have been just a reminder of how much he'd lost. It would be an indication that he was in a vocation, that it was the most despised vocation in Egypt, where he'd grown up, and all of that in that staff. But it was a shepherd's staff, and the shepherd's staff is a great comfort to the sheep. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Why would the sheep be comforted by the sight of the shepherd's staff? Because that staff would be used to gently nudge the sheep in the right direction. So one of the things the shepherd would use to help guide the sheep, to get them on the right path, lead them to greener pastures, take them to still waters. That staff would also be, along with the shepherd's rod, that which could be thrown, but it could be used as a weapon if needed. A good shepherd might fight off the predator, might put the wolf away by using that staff. And what else is interesting about the staff, and this is probably the reason the Lord chose it to be the first sign that he would give Moses, is the staff was also a symbol of royalty in Egypt. It was used as a metaphor for Pharaoh to be the shepherd over everyone. And you'll see in ancient hieroglyphics, you'll see that wherever Pharaoh is depicted, there's usually a symbolic shepherd's crook. Usually that shepherd's crook would have a stylized animal's head at the curved top of the shepherd's staff. So all that's involved. God said, what's in your hand is personal, your hand, not someone else's. And God could have chosen any possession of imaginable to use in that miracle, but the staff was the thing that was in his hand. Can't be any closer than that. Staff, symbol of obscurity for Moses, yet of care and also ultimate royalty, a thing that was uniquely Moses's and intimately close to him. So often we look at our lives and we say, I don't have anything. I look back over my life, you say, I come from a broken family. I come from pain. I come from shame. I come from problems. We can think like that. And the Lord looks at that, beloved, and says, okay, I can use that. What do you have? What do you have? You go, well, I've got a divorce. I've got some kids that seem to be wayward right now. Okay, God says, I can use that. What do you have? What do you have in hand? Well, I've got some disappointments. Okay, God knows about it. He says, I can use that. What is in your hand? And then Exodus 4:3, in verse 3, and he said, throw it on the ground. Throw it on the ground. Let go of it. Take the humble gift in your hand and release it. This is the seed principle that we've talked about so much. We're like farmers. Whatever seed we have, in order to multiply it, we got to let it go. Throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. At first, it just didn't seem like a blessing. It seemed like it had gotten worse. Before it was a seemingly harmless staff, now it's a snake. But watch what God does. Exodus 4:4. The Lord said to Moses, put out your hand, catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So what has God done for Moses? God has shown Moses the means by which he would be believable. It wouldn't be Moses that was convincing. It would be God who was convincing. God has shown himself mighty enough to use whatever simple thing Moses had in his hand. God's essentially saying, what you think is insignificant and unusable, I find significant and usable. So whatever small gift you have, whatever seemingly insignificant tool you have in your tool belt, whatever you have, if you'll let it go when I tell you, God's saying, I'll show you my power. Moses doesn't do something impressive for God. God does something impressive for Moses. Moses doesn't prove himself for God. God proves himself for Moses. What's the one thing God asks of Moses? Surrender what you have. Don't keep a tight grip on it. Treat it like a farmer treats seeds. Everything you have can be released in order to become something greater. It's what we do when we release any gift in our lives, our time, our treasure, our spiritual gifts. We just let go upon the command of God and let God do His miraculous work. When you feel like what you have isn't that significant, it's tempting all the more to hold on tightly. But God says, let it go. Nothing becomes what it is destined to become if we can't, at the proper time, let it go. It's a good picture of sowing and reaping, isn't it? Like a farmer who's got seed. Spent good money on the seed, let it go. If you want to have a good harvest, let it go. Things God tells you to let go of because He has a plan to return it back into your hand in a different, more powerful way. That ordinary staff will become the symbol of God's power. It'll strike a rock so that living water will gush forth. It'll provide the thirst for a nation. The staff that was guiding sheep, but God wanted to return it to Moses to guide a nation. It's a staff that might defend the flock from a wolf, but God wanted to use it to defend the people of God from Pharaoh. An ordinary staff that was released. And when God took the staff, it became supernatural, became the symbol of His power. Let it go. So, over 25 years ago, we had a pastor named David Beatty, and God had called him to plant a church. And I love David, and I love him so much to this day. And I loved all the people who might go and plant that church. But it was clear, God was calling us to. So we had to let it go. And what was returned to our hand? A church that flourished. That church that we planted grew as large as the Sending Church very quickly, reaching countless new people for Christ. Over 10 years ago, we had a sense of call of God at Ronaldo to launch a new campus for a 100-year-old congregation and become multi-site. So it felt risky, but we let go. And this Christmas Eve, at that first location that we launched a campus in Kernersville, we had 2 Christmas Eve services, around 300 people in Kernersville that would have never driven into Winston-Salem. And then there was Clemens, and there's the King campus. When you let go, it's amazing what God brings back to you. It's amazing how often, when we let go, for a little while, it feels scary. Like Moses must have felt when he saw the snake. If you make it your habit to follow God and let go when He says let go, there'll be times when you second guess it immediately. What have I done? It looks like a snake. Well, you must wait on God. He'll put His hand out and help you. And when He brings it back to you, it's different. Pick it up. Now, y'all might, it might have been really hard for Moses, y'all, to think about letting go of the one thing he had and to throw it on the ground. But I'll tell you what was much harder, and that's to pick up a snake. The farmer is, much busier during harvest time. In fact, of the matter, in life, we may not realize this, but we often run from the very blessing that God's bringing into our lives. And it can't be lost upon us here that there are 2 vibrant symbols, significant symbols by this serpent. The first, Moses most certainly understood because he'd seen it every day of his life on Pharaoh's head. It was a headpiece that was protruding out from the forehead, a cobra, usually golden. You see it on every ancient hieroglyphic depicting Pharaoh. The cobra serpent was a symbol of the sovereignty of Egypt. And when he picked up that snake, God was saying, we're going to show you where the real authority is. There was a serpent much earlier, slithered into the garden in the beginning. It was the prince of darkness, the accuser of the brethren. Satan was metaphorically represented as a serpent. The snake was a deceiver, was wily. And Moses is told to pick up the snake. He's told to pick it up because there's a picture of authority over that kind of evil. But he's told to pick it up by the tail. That's absolutely the worst way to pick up a snake. Not that I've ever picked up a snake. But if I were to pick up a snake, I would not pick it up by its tail. You can pick up a snake by the tail. You don't do that because that way the snake could come out and bite you. But it was part of God saying, I want you to see today, you have authority, Moses. I'm investing in you. Though Pharaoh seems to have all the power, you're going to have the authority in my name. I want you to see even more than that. I want you to see that you have authority over evil. So here's the picture. He throws it down, becomes a snake. He starts running from the snake. The snake is shaping what he does. And God says, no, pick it up. You're going to shape what it does. You're going to shape it. And so I'm seeing greater seed in you than he that's in the world. I'm seeing greater authority here. I'm saying don't be afraid of the serpent because God's all powerful. That's what's involved in this, is to say God can take the very thing that looks most evil and end up using it for his glorious purposes. You meant it for evil, Joseph said to his brothers, but God meant it for good. He's so redemptive. He's so awesome. He's so capable. You grab it because I have a destiny for you. It came in the fullness of time in which God said there was no one righteous in the world. So he took what was at his right hand, the Father, sent his only begotten Son, became a man of the dust like we are, and he lived and he loved and he healed and he delivered and he raised the dead and he blessed the poor, and they hated him for it. And when he hung on the cross and breathed his last, it was as if all of hell thought they had won. But on the third day, he took him back to his right hand. And in so doing, God delivered the world from the power of Satan. He gave you and I the opportunity to become children of God. This is the way of God. He takes the unlikely, he takes the ordinary, he takes whatever's in your hand, and he uses it for your glory, for your good, and for the transformation of the world. So I ask with God, what's that in your hand? Whether you're young or old, man or woman, boy or girl, rich or poor, matters not to God. It's just yielding what's in your hand, recognizing it. Let God's grace flow through you, because if God says, what's that in your hand? It means there really is something there that he can use.